All right, yesterday's video where we talked about some of the bigger non-con games coming up next year in the 2025 college football season really got me motivated and excited, I think. I feel like, I don't know if waste is the right word, but over the last 6 weeks or so, it feels like it's been a lot of complaining. I'm not pointing fingers. I'm talking about myself. Some of these changes that have come out and canceling spring games and non-con and the never-ending transfer portal and NIL stuff, I really feel like I haven't just talked about football really since the season ended. And doing that video yesterday, I think helped rejuvenate me to talk some college football. So I have set a goal for myself for the month of March. Today's March 2nd. Yesterday, March 1st, we talked football. We talked about some of the bigger non-conference games coming up next season. Today is March 2nd. We're going to talk about a couple of teams' schedules. We're going to do Alabama and Florida State today. I'm going to make it a goal every single day this month, during the month of March. I'm going to come on here and I'm going to talk about football. I'm not going to complain about playoff structure or seeding or spring games getting canceled or the college football calendar or rules that need to be changed. There's plenty of time to do that. And I'm not turning over some kind of new leaf where I'm done complaining and ranting and raving. This channel is built on that. And believe me, there will be plenty of that on this channel from now to the end of time. But I need to talk some college football for my own sanity. So I'm going to make it a personal goal to spend every day during the month of March doing exactly that, talking about college football and avoiding some of the off the field kind of storylines, lawsuits, Florida State or whatever with the lawsuits, transfer portal, and all that kind of stuff. So we're going to see if we can do it. Now, these schedule previews that I call them, or I do this every year. And let me make a couple of disclaimers before we jump in. Again, we're going to do Alabama and Florida State today. These are not prediction videos. These are not videos where I talk about who I think might be starting at quarterback for Alabama and what that might mean for their overall record or their season and how it may shape up. This has nothing to do with who the coaches are, or this is strictly looking at team schedules and starting to develop an idea about these teams moving into the 2025 season. I do prediction videos every year, but I don't start those until usually around the end of May or beginning of June. I like to get through spring practice. You have a transfer portal window that opens up after spring practice for a couple of weeks, so you still got some roster movement going on and things like that. And it gives me a few months to kind of ramp up starting now through when I start those at the end of May or beginning of June before I start doing any actual predictions. But doing things like this, sitting down and looking at teams' schedules, that plays into what eventually will become my predictions for some of these teams, right? Schedules have never been equal in college football. So you can take two teams, swap their schedules around, and they could end up with completely different records than what they had in reality, right? Because no two schedules are created equally. That's been compounded over the last couple of years by the fact that a lot of these conferences have gotten a lot bigger. The ACC has added schools. The SEC has added schools. The Big Ten has added schools. The Big 12 has added schools. So you've got, you play 12 games a year. You play 8 or 9 conference games. That's it, right? Well, if you got 14, 16, 18 teams in your conference, you can't play all of those teams, right? So by default, different teams within the same conference are going to have different, difficulties when it comes to the schedule. So by spending a few weeks or a month this time of year starting to look into these different teams' schedules, that does play a role to what later on down the road becomes part of my prediction videos that I do. And, a couple of obvious examples here. Just pick out a team last year that you think had like a really brutal schedule, let's say Florida, okay? And then you can find another team in the SEC somewhere that you think maybe didn't have nearly as tough of a schedule as Florida did. Let's go with Texas or Missouri. Now, that's not Texas or Missouri's fault. It's not Florida's fault. The sort of conference schedules are handed out by the league office. You don't have a whole lot of say-so on who you play within the conference, but the reality is different teams are going to have different strengths and weaknesses on their schedule. And sitting down and looking at these schedules, I think, is important, more important now than ever because of expanded conferences. and sort of starting to build the foundation of what will later become maybe a prediction for certain teams or things like that. So let's start with Alabama. I'm going to put the schedules up over here. And again, we'll just kind of go through them. If you've watched my channel for a while, you're familiar with these videos. And I'm not going to give this big, long speech at the beginning of every schedule preview video. If somebody asks questions or whatever, I'll just direct them back to the beginning of this video. For future schedule preview videos, we're just going to jump right in, but I wanted to get those things out of the way first. So when I look at a schedule, here's Alabama. Now, before I just start with game one and kind of work my way through it, I look for sort of different groups of games. So one of the first things that I'll look for here will be non-con games. So in the case of Alabama this year, sort of an unusual year for Alabama in that they play two power conference opponents, non-con power conference opponents this year. They open up the season August 30th on the road at Florida State. A couple of weeks later, they host Wisconsin. That's a return matchup from last year. Bama went up to Madison and played Wisconsin. So Bama's got Florida State and Wisconsin, an ACC team and a Big Ten team, in addition to their 8 SEC conference games that they'll play this season. So Alabama's got 10 games this year against quote-unquote Power 4 opponents. In addition to Florida State and Wisconsin, they also play Louisiana Monroe in week 2, looks like September 6th. And then later on in the year, November 22nd, they host Eastern Illinois. So those are their sort of non-con games there. And again, this sort of starts to set the foundation for what you think a team's overall record may end up being. In other words, worst case scenario here. I mean, absolute worst. Bama goes 2-2 there, right? Probably go 4-0. Florida State, kind of down. Again, these aren't prediction videos. I'm just pointing out part of my reasoning and process for even doing schedule preview videos or even looking at teams' schedules is so I can start to build the foundation of what later will become my predictions for teams. So when I look at Alabama's non-con schedule, I see 4 games where Alabama will be favored. They'll be favored on the road in Tallahassee. They'll be favored at home against Wisconsin, and they'll be favored obviously against those 2 lower classification schools that they play, Eastern Illinois and Louisiana Monroe. Then I look for road games. Road games are obviously more difficult than home games, right? Particularly where they fall on the schedule. If you have a difficult road game, does it come after a bye week? That might matter. Do you have 2 road games in a row at any point on your schedule? If so, that second game especially can be particularly tricky, right? Do you have a road game after what might be a huge emotional home game? In other words, let's say you have a rivalry game at home in week 4, and you're expecting that to be a great game against a good opponent. What if the following week you got to turn around and play at LSU or whatever the case is, right? Those are the kinds of things I start to look at here. So you look at the road schedule here. We mentioned on the road at Florida State to start the season. Then you get into their conference schedule. Their first road game of the season in conference is at Georgia. So it doesn't get much tougher than that within the SEC. However, it is following a bye week. So Bama gets a bye week on September 20th. They then travel to play on the road at UGA. They play at Missouri. They handled Missouri last year. It was 50-0. I don't remember what it was, but they beat the soul out of Missouri. Disappointing season for Missouri last year. I don't think Missouri's a particularly tough place to play, unlike Georgia. I think Georgia's got the longest home winning streak in the SEC, if I'm not mistaken. They haven't lost at home since 2019. So that will be a difficult environment for Alabama to go into at Georgia. I don't think that will be the case for Missouri, smaller stadium. At South Carolina, that will be a difficult place to play. This was one of the best games in college football last year, that game in Tuscaloosa between Bama and South Carolina. South Carolina was this close in 2 or 3 games. Sort of the ball bounces one way or the other in a couple of games. South Carolina was really close to having a pretty special season. They host Bama this year, South Carolina does. Bama plays them on October 25th, right after they play Tennessee. So this is a situation I was talking about earlier. You've rivalry game, it'd probably be a good game. It's been a good game the last couple of years. Alabama had Tennessee's number for what seemed like forever, but Tennessee's actually beaten Alabama 2 of the last 3 years. Now, both of those Tennessee wins over Bama came in Knoxville. Tennessee's got to travel to Tuscaloosa and take on Alabama at Bryant-Denny Stadium this year, but it'll be a big emotional environment, right? And then they have to turn around that following week and play at a pretty difficult place to play in Columbia. So that could be a tricky 2-game stretch there for Alabama, home against Tennessee, on the road at South Carolina. Another bye week. and they finished the season on the road at Auburn. So we looked at the non-con portion of the schedule. Now you're looking at the road games. You've got games at Auburn, at South Carolina, at Missouri, and at Georgia. 3 of those places are difficult to play. Auburn, Georgia, and South Carolina. One of those teams is a top 5, top 10 team heading into next season, Georgia. South Carolina finished in the top 15 last year, going to be ranked probably top 20 in a lot of preseason rankings this year. Auburn still kind of trying to prove itself under Hugh Freeze, but we all know Bama's struggles on the road at Jordan-Hare. So pretty difficult road schedule there for Bama. Now you'll take a look at their home games here in conference. We already talked about the non-con. So they start things off on the road at Georgia, but then they home against Vandy. Now, look, I know Vandy beat Bama last year, but the reason it's so funny is because it's very unlikely to happen in any random year. So they get them at home. Bama will be a huge favorite. There will be a lot of jokes made, I'm sure, that week heading into that game, but that's a game where Bama will be a significant favorite and be expected to win. Talked about the game at Missouri and then home against Tennessee, and the home game against Tennessee before going on the road at South Carolina. So Vandy at home, Tennessee at home. They get LSU at home, again, coming off of a bye week. So the bye weeks fall in a pretty good place for Bama here. They get them an early bye week in the season before they have to go on the road to play Georgia. And then they get another bye week sort of, 2/3 of the way through the season after they. So that's a great place for the bye week there. You looking at 2 what could be difficult games there at home against Tennessee, on the road at South Carolina, and you get a little bit of a break before you host LSU. So the bye week falls in a good spot. Home against Oklahoma, again, a game that Bama lost last year, really had no business losing, just absolutely one of the more embarrassing losses that Alabama suffered in the last 15 years. That loss to Oklahoma last year. So revenge factor there. They get Oklahoma at home. Eastern Illinois, mentioned them already, and then at Auburn. So that's sort of how I look at the schedule grouping of games there. I look at the non-con, I look at the road games, look at the home games. Are there any back-to-back road games and difficult sets of 2 or 3 games lumped together? Where are the bye weeks? That kind of thing. So that's Bama's schedule. Is it an easy schedule? No. Is it workable? Is it manageable? I think so. I think they'll be a significant favorite at Florida State and at home against Wisconsin. And look, Bama's not going to get any credit for playing Florida State and Wisconsin, and that's unfortunate. They've caught a lot of crap over the years, Alabama has, for some of their scheduling practices under Nick Saban. And I'm not here to argue that one way or the other. But you've got to give them credit for this scheduling here. It is not Alabama's fault, nor did Alabama know that Florida State was going to fall off of a cliff last year and that they would catch Florida State in a year where they're trying to dig themselves out of a crater. Bama had no way of knowing that. So good on Bama for scheduling this home and home. They scheduled the Wisconsin thing. I know Wisconsin's not necessarily a perennial winner of the Big Ten or national title contender or anything like that, but over the last 20 or 25 years or so, other than Oregon, Wisconsin is probably the team that's won the most amount of games without winning a natty. That's an interesting conversation to have, by the way. What are the best teams or best programs this century? So the best programs over the last 25 years with 0 natties. Oregon and Wisconsin are 2 that come to mind. So again, not Bama's fault that Wisconsin has changed coaches in the last few years and Luke Fickell's kind of struggled there. I don't know what else you would want from a team like Bama or any other team really than to schedule a couple of non-con games like this. So I think you got to give them some credit there. That being said, there'll be significant favorites in both. First test of the season, I think, comes after that bye week on the road at Georgia. They've had Georgia's number for what seems like forever. But Kirby's 1-6 against them or whatever. So it'll be a big game for Georgia, I think, more so than Bama. If Bama loses that game, I don't think that would be embarrassing or people laughing at Alabama or whatever. I think the pressure's on Georgia in that game. So kind of like a free roll there for Bama on the road at UGA, especially since Kalen DeBoer got a win against Kirby and Georgia last season. Vanderbilt, a revenge game, I know, but again, they'll be a huge favorite. At Missouri, they blew them out last year. They should be a big favorite again. Home against Tennessee, probably the first or second biggest game of the year, depending on what you feel about the Iron Bowl or maybe the Georgia game. On the road at South Carolina, I think, is a very difficult spot here for Alabama. South Carolina was this close to beating them last year. I don't think South Carolina will be intimidated. I don't think they'll show up expecting to lose that game. They went into Bryant-Denny and probably should have won that game, came up a little bit short. They'll be motivated this year. Lenore Sellers is back at quarterback for them. It comes right after the Tennessee game. That's the trickiest two-game stretch, I think, for Alabama all year. That home game against Tennessee and then on the road at South Carolina. LSU, we'll see. Some people are really high on LSU. I'm kind of in a wait-and-see type of mode on them. A lot of turnover through the portal. We'll see how that works out. Oklahoma, another new quarterback. Supposed to be better this year, but we'll see. I think Brent Venables might be running out of time there. And then finishing the season up on the road with the Iron Bowl at Auburn. So there you go. That's Alabama's schedule. What do you think about it? Let me know down below. Let's pull up Florida State and take a look here. Now, of course, they went 2-10 last year and absolutely just, there's no words. It was an absolutely abysmal season for Mike Norvell and Florida State. It just went completely off the rails. Their defense, I thought, played okay. In fact, their defense probably played better than okay. Their defense kept them in a lot of games. Their offense was absolutely atrocious. You got to look real hard to find an offense in the last 20 years that was worse than what Florida State put on the field last year. So I do expect significant improvement from Florida State in 2025. Now, keep in mind, they won 2 games last year. So significant improvement would be making a bowl game. Okay, that'd be, if they get to 6 wins, they will have won 3 times as many games as they won last year. So again, this isn't a prediction video. I'm not predicting them to win 6 games. I'm not predicting them to go 12-0. I'm just saying I would expect Florida State to take a significant step forward in 2025. Let's see if the schedule lines up for something like that to possibly happen. Talked about the Alabama game. They start off at home against Alabama. Now, it would be a massive win and a huge shock, I think, to the college football world if Florida State were able to pull this off against Alabama. We'll see. I talked about it when I talked about the Bama video, but Bama will be, I think, a significant favorite in that game. Then they play the East Texas A&M Lions. I'm going to be honest with you, I never even heard of that. They get their first bye week really early in the season there on September. Now, see, here's an example of a terrible bye week. Just a horrendous bye week here. There's no reason to have a bye week between East Texas and Kent State. And there's no reason to have a bye week in week 3. Now, maybe if you had a huge game in week 4 against a really tough opponent, maybe you hope for a bye week in week 3. But this is a complete and total waste of a bye week here. Now, the schools don't have a whole lot of say-so in when they get their bye week, because again, in a lot of cases, the league offices are setting the schedules, particularly the conference schedules. Okay. So I'm not blaming Florida State and saying they screwed up by putting their bye week in week 3, but I think given the choice, Florida State itself and surely their fans would much rather have this bye week, say, between the Virginia and the Miami game a little further down the line there, right? Or maybe right before the Clemson game on November 8th. Just no real benefit, I don't think, to having a bye week there. Their other bye week comes on October 25th, again, between Stanford and Wake Forest. Now, that bye week comes at a good part of the season, a little over the halfway point, about a week before Halloween. So it falls at a good spot in the season. But again, do you really need to separate the Stanford and Wake Forest game? Those are 2 of the easier games on the schedule, right? Maybe you'd rather move that thing again before the Miami game, before the Clemson game, whatever the case. But when it comes to non-con, you've got Alabama at home, East Texas at home, and Kent State at home. Those are the first 3 games of the year, all non-con games. And then you finish things up, of course, with your annual rivalry against Florida. And this year you play them on the road at the Swamp. And the Gators will probably be a favorite in that game. Lagway's back at QB, and while I don't think Florida's a great team, they appear to be a little bit further ahead right now, at least than Florida State is. But again, in a rivalry game, anything can happen. But that's the non-con. So again, kudos to Florida State playing 2 non-con Power 5 opponents, hosting Alabama and playing on the road at Florida, in addition to their 8 SEC or ACC games. Where are the road games? First road game of the year at Virginia. Virginia, over the last decade or so, has been one of the worst teams in the ACC. So other than the fact that that's a road game, you would think that's a game potentially that Florida State could compete in and maybe even win. At Stanford, other than the travel, coast-to-coast travel there, Stanford, again, hasn't been very good lately. I don't see any reason for that necessarily to change. That's a game I think Florida State could win. At Clemson, that's a tough one there. You can see here on this schedule, they've got them ranked at 7. I don't know where they're getting that ranking from. If that's the ranking from the end of last season or what they're going off of with that ranking there. But I've got Clemson higher than that in my preseason ranking. Cade Klubnik had a great year last year. I love the hire they made at defensive coordinator, bringing Tom Allen in from Penn State. They still have a lot of talent on that side of the ball. And if they can find a way to replace Maffa at running back and get a little bit more production out of those wide receivers, I think Clemson could really make a run this year. This is a tough spot here for Florida State on the road at Tatertown. At NC State, I'm guessing there's going to be people that hype up NC State this offseason and tell me they've got a chance to win the ACC, because it seems like that happens every single year, and then Dave Duren goes 8-4. NC State is basically the Texas A&M of the ACC. I'm tired of hearing about them until they do something beyond 8 wins, whatever, and compete for the ACC or something. I'm just tired of hearing about them. That's a game Florida State could potentially win. And then we already talked about the game on the road at Florida. So a pretty difficult road schedule, I think. You've got games at Florida where you'll be an underdog, at Clemson where you'll be an underdog, at NC State, a game I think you can win, at Stanford, a game I think you can win, but clear across the country. As far as like difficult stretches of games here, I mean, Virginia Tech, NC State, Florida to close out Clemson, Virginia Tech, NC State, and Florida to close out the season. Not the easiest 4-game stretch I've ever seen. A couple of ranked teams there, most likely, with Clemson and Florida. And then you got to travel to NC State. So a pretty difficult close to the season there for Florida State. Of course, you open up with Alabama, which is going to be a tough one. The rivalry game against Miami, who right now appears to be way further along than Florida State is. So a pretty difficult schedule here. From Florida State. Alabama, East Texas, and Kent State to open up the season. You got to assume 2-1 there probably. On the road at Virginia, Miami at home, Pitt at home, and on the road at Stanford. If Florida State finds a way to go 3-1 there between Virginia, Miami, Pitt, and Stanford, then they're well on their way, obviously, to making a bowl game. Come out of another bye week. Wake Forest on the road at Clemson. Probably split those, and then of course finishing up with Virginia, NC State, and Florida. And do you go 2-1 there, or do you go 1-2? Probably what it's going to come down to. But there you go, a look at Florida State's schedule for 2025. Leave me some suggestions down below. I'm going to do a ton of these videos over the month of March. Again, every day college football talk for the entire month of March. That I'm making that my goal. I'm going to try not to get sidetracked and rant and rave on something. Hopefully nothing happens in the news or whatever that sets me off. But anyway, give me some suggestions down below. What teams would you like to hear me talk about? What teams would you like to see me pull their schedule up on the screen and go through it like we've done these two here, Alabama and Florida State? But I appreciate you watching. Have a good morning.